Welcome, listeners, to episode 5 of the Bigfoot Legends and Connections podcast. This episode is one of the most famous and iconic Bigfoot stories of all time. The story of the prospector Fred Beck and his fellow gold miners and their encounter with Sasquatch and other supernatural entities in a mysterious area near Mount Saint Helens, Washington, that has come to be known as Ape Canyon. So my question for all the Bigfoot believers and skeptics alike is this: how do you reconcile the fact that literally every culture in the world today has legends and connections to the creature we often refer to as Bigfoot, dating back to the dawn of time? Is this just coincidence, or is it something more? Why do all the stories contain the same recurring descriptions and themes? Whether they call them Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti, Yeren, Skunk Ape, Yowie, or some other name, the reports are all the same. From America to China, the Himalayas to Australia, literally every continent has the same phenomenon. Why do we see such similarities? How could this story permeate throughout the entire globe? Is there definitive proof of the existence of Bigfoot? That's what I'm on a mission to figure out. Join me as we uncover the stories, the evidences, and the unbelievable yet true events that have occurred all throughout the world. My goal is to turn skeptics into believers, and believers into knowers. I'm Riley Woolner, and welcome to the Bigfoot Legends and Connections podcast. These are the words of Fred Beck. First of all, I wish to give an account of the attack and tell of the famous incident of July 1924 when the quote-unquote hairy apes attacked our cabin. We had been prospecting for 6 years in the Mount Saint Helens and Lewis River area in southwest Washington. We had from time to time come across large tracks by creek beds and springs. In 1924, I and 4 other miners were working our gold claim, the Vanderwhite. It was 2 miles east of Mount Saint Helens near a deep canyon now named quote-unquote Ape Canyon, which was so named after an account of the incident reached the newspapers. Hank, a great hunter and a good woodsman, was always a little apprehensive after seeing the tracks. The tracks were large, and we knew that no known animal could have made them. The largest measured 19 inches long. It was in the middle of July, and we had received a good assay on our claim, and everyone was excited. I remember I had a tooth that was aching, and I suggested to Hank that he should take me down to see a dentist. But he was so enthused in the prospects of the gold mine, he barely took time to answer me. He replied that God or the devil could not get him away from there. We had all come up in this Ford, and I had no way to get down to town unless he took me. So when we went back to our cabin on the north side of the canyon, I had a nagging toothache and a little appetite for our evening meal of beans and hotcakes. Hank, though apprehensive, was still determined. We had been hearing noises in the evening for about a week. We heard a shrill, peculiar whistling each evening. We would hear it coming from one ridge, and then hear an answering whistle coming from another ridge. He also heard a sound which I could best describe as a booming, thumping sound. Hank asked me to accompany him to the spring, about 100 yards from our cabin, to get some water, and suggested we take our rifles, to be on the safe side. We walked to the spring, and then Hank yelled and raised his rifle, and at that instant I saw it. It was a hairy creature, and he was about 100 yards away, on the other side of a little canyon, standing by a pine tree. It dodged behind the tree and poked its head out from the side of the tree, and at that same time Hank shot. I could see the bark fly from the tree from each of his 3 shots. Someone may say that was quite a distance to see the bark fly, but I saw it. The creature I judged to have been about 7 feet tall with blackish brown hair. It disappeared from our view for a short time, but then we saw it, running fast and upright about 200 yards down the little canyon. I shot 3 times before it disappeared from view. We took the water back to the cabin and explained the affair to the rest of the party. We all agreed, including Hank, to go home the next morning as it would be dark before we could get to the car. We agreed it would be unsound to be caught by darkness on the way out. Nightfall found us in our pine log cabin. We had built the cabin ourselves and had made it very sturdy. It stood for years afterward, and was visited by many sightseers until a few years ago when it was burned to the ground. The circumstances of the fire I do not recall. In the cabin, we had a long bunk bed in which two could sleep, feet to feet, the rest of us sleeping on pine boughs on the floor. At one end of the cabin, we had a fireplace fashioned out of rocks. There were no windows in the cabin, so darkness found all of us in the cabin more calm now, and my tooth was better. Somehow the excitement seemed to work a temporary cure on it. We were sitting around puffing on pipes and talking about the trip home the next day. Each of us settled down in his crude but welcomed bed and soon fell asleep. About midnight we were all awakened. Hank, who was sleeping on the floor, was yelling and kicking, but the noise that had awakened us was a tremendous thud against the cabin wall. Some of the chinking had been knocked loose from between the logs and had fallen across Hank's chest. He had his rifle in his hand, and he was waving it back and forth as he kicked and yelled. Hank always slept with his gun nearby. It was a Remington automatic, my gun being a .30-30 Winchester, which I still have. I helped to get the chinking off him, and he jumped to his feet. Then we heard a great commotion outside. It sounded like a great number of feet trampling and rattling over a pile of our unused shakes. We grabbed our guns. Hank squinted through the space left by the chinking. By actual count, we saw only 3 of the creatures together at one time, but it sounded like there were many more. This was the start of the famous attack, of which so much had been written in Washington and Oregon papers throughout the years. Most accounts tell of giant boulders being hurled against the cabin and say some even fell through the roof, but this was not quite the case. There were very few large rocks around in that area. It is true that many smaller ones were hurled at the cabin, but they did not break through the roof, but hit with a bang and rolled off. Some did fall through the chimney of the fireplace, and some accounts state that I was hit in the head by a rock and knocked unconscious. This is not true. The only time we shot our guns that night was when the creatures were attacking our cabin. When they would quiet down for a few minutes, we would quit shooting. I told the rest of the party that maybe if they saw we were only shooting when they attacked, they might realize we were only defending ourselves. We could have had clear shots at them through the opening left by the chinking had we chosen to shoot. We did shoot, however, when they climbed up on our roof. We shot round after round through the roof. We had to brace the hewed log door with a long pole taken from the bunk bed. The creatures were pushing against it, and the whole door vibrated from the impact. We responded by firing many more rounds through the door. They pushed against the walls of the cabin as if trying to push the cabin over, but this was pretty much an impossibility. As previously stated, the cabin was a sturdy made building. Hank and I did most of the shooting. The rest of the party crowded to the far end of the cabin, guns in their hands. One had a pistol, which still is in my family's possession. The others clutched their rifles. They seemed stunned and incredulous. The attack continued the remainder of the night, with only short intervals between. A most profound and frightening experience occurred when one of the creatures, being close to the cabin, reached an arm through the chinking space and seized one of our axes by the handle. A much written about incident, and a true one. Before the thing could pull the axe out, I swiftly turned the head of the axe upright so that it caught on the logs, and at the same time Hank shot, barely missing my hand. The creature let go, and I pulled the handle back in and put the axe in a safe place. A humorous thing I well remember was Hank singing, quote, "If you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone, and we'll all go home in the morning," end quote. He did not mean it to be humorous, for Hank was dead serious and sang under the impression that the mountain devils, as he called them, might understand and go away. The attack ended just before daylight. Just as soon as we were sure it was light enough to see, we came cautiously out of the cabin. It was not long before I saw one of the ape-like creatures, standing about 80 yards away near the edge of Ape Canyon. I shot 3 times and it toppled over the cliff, down into the gorge some 400 feet below. Then Hank said that we should get out of there as soon as possible, and not bother to pack our supplies or equipment out. After all, he said, it's better to lose them than our lives. We were all only too glad to agree. We brought only that which we could get in our pack sacks. We left about $200 in supplies, powder, and drilling equipment behind. I tried to persuade everyone not to relate the happenings to anyone, and they agreed, but Hank soon let the cat out of the bag. We made our way to Spirit Lake, and Hank went into the ranger station. He had told the ranger earlier about the tracks, and the ranger had replied, "Let me know if you find out what they are." That was just what Hank did, to the puzzlement of the ranger. When we were back home in Kelso, Washington, he told some of his friends, and somehow the story leaked out to the papers, and the great hairy ape hunt of 1924 was on. Local reporters interviewed us. They came from Portland and Seattle. Even a big game hunter from England came asking questions. And he had a large gun with him that must have been an elephant gun. Many people flocked to Mount Saint Helens area looking for the great hairy apes or the mountain devils. I myself went back with 2 reporters and a detective from Portland, Oregon. We found large tracks, and they photographed them. We did not see any of the ape men then, nor could we find the ones that we had shot. So people were asking questions. What is true? Or was it just a wild tale? I can assure you it is true. Are they human, animal, or devils? I will answer that question in this book. That was a great ape hunt in 1924, and the last few years more and more people have reported seeing them. There is an ape hunt being revived again, and another man has written a book on the subject and has formed a club whose purpose is to find evidence to prove what they already believe, that abominable snowmen of America do exist. A wealthy person has offered a large sum of money for anyone that can capture one alive. Sightings have been reported in Canada, Washington, Oregon, and Northern California, but the purpose of this book is not only to relate my experiences, but also to bring to light my knowledge about the abominable snowman. I do not wish to embark upon an expedition, but I wish to tell what these beings are. I told you about the attack, and now I want to go into the background and tell a little concerning our activities. They will be colorful, and from them emerge a spiritual and metaphysical understanding of the case. First of all, I hope this book does not discourage too much those interested souls who are looking and trying to solve the mystery of the abominable snowmen. If someone captured one, I would have to swallow most of the content of this book, for I'm about to make a bold statement. No one will ever capture one, and no one will ever kill one. In other words, present to the world a living one in a cage, or find a dead body of one to be examined by science. I know there are stories that some have been captured but got away. I say this confident by the evidence of my experiences, things that I have not before revealed to the public, and I also say it from the knowledge gained on the subject later. In this book I will reveal thoroughly what I know them to be. First of all, I will say that they are not entirely of this world. I know the reaction we experienced as these beings attacked our cabin impressed many with the concept of great ape-like men dwelling in the mountains, and I can say that we genuinely fought and were quite fearful, and we were glad to get out of the mountains, but I was, for one, always conscious that we were dealing with supernatural beings, and I know the other members of the party felt the same. The events leading up to the ape episode were filled with psychic element, and our time spent in Mount Saint Helens was a series of psychic experiences. The method by which we found our mine was psychic. I was mentioning these facts to help build a background of understanding in a case which has been wholly explained in a material sense. As I will explain the mysterious realities of the abominable snowmen, so must I show some of my inner experiences, for in my mind the two have always been closely connected together, and as I will show, these beings bear a distinct association with the psychic realm. In 1922, we found the location of our mine. A spiritual being, a large Indian, dressed in buckskin, appeared to us and talked to us. He was the picture of stateliness itself. He never told us his name, but we always called him the Great Spirit. He replied once, quote, "The Great Spirit is above me. We are all of the Great Spirit, if we listen when the Great Spirit talks." End quote. There was another spiritual being which appeared to us, more in the role of a comforting friend, and we learned her name. One of our party suggested later that we name our mine after her, and so the mining claim we later filed bore her last name. The big Indian being told us there would be a white arrow that would go before us. Another man who was not present during the attack in 1924 could see the arrow easily and clearly at all times, and I could see it nearly as well. So we started by the Lewis River south of Mount Saint Helens and went up the muddy river, and in all we followed the white arrow for days. The going was slow, for in those days it was very rugged territory. Hank's temper was growing short as he climbed the hills. He had always been a believer of spiritual things, and afterwards he was a believer, but he lost his temper and cussed. He swore at the spirit leading us. His face was red, and we could not stop him. "Just a wild goose chase," he exclaimed. "They lied to us, and got us running all over the hills, and I want nothing more to do with them," he went on and on. Then, just when he had started to calm down, we all saw the arrow soar up high, change direction, and swoop down. We had to follow in the general direction before we could find it again. It hovered near the top of the north cliff of Ape Canyon. That was the site where we later blasted out our shaft. We got a little closer, and we all saw the image of a large door open, and the big Indian appeared in front of it. He spoke, quote, "Because you have cursed the spirit leading you, you will be shown where there is gold, but it is not given to you." End quote. With those words, he disappeared. Then we saw the door slowly close. There was a huge lock and latch, but as the door shut, the lock did not latch. A closed door, but it was not locked. "We might as well pack up and go home," one of the party said. And that is just the way our gold mine turned out. Closed, but not locked. We worked that mine for 2 years, and one assay showed well over $2,000 a ton. There is a pocket of gold in that cliff, if someone is fortunate enough to find it. We gave up looking for it. The picture I'm trying to paint for you is a picture of manifestation. In this book, I have showed also some of our high manifestation, as we had many of a high nature the 6 years we spent in the Mount Saint Helens area. Of course, the lower or grosser manifestations were in the appearing of these hairy creatures called abominable snowmen, also called hairy apes, Bigfoot, and Sasquatch, according to the region they are seen in. I believe they have always existed, although our encounter with them in 1924 was the first major report of anyone coming in contact with them. Other writings have documented the cases very well. I just like to show the reason for their appearances. For 6 years, all had been peaceful. We were simple men and hard-working men, and an aura of good or spiritual power surrounded us. We had seen the tracks, but the makers of them had left us alone. No one was really worried about the tracks as regarding any threat to our safety, but after one of us had lost his temper and denounced the spirit leading us as a liar, from that time on, a quiet apprehensiveness settled over us. We continued working our claim, but deep down, we felt it would avail to no good end. We had bursts of enthusiasm, but no success. And yet we did have success because we learned. Nothing can replace experience as a teacher. There are a couple experiences which show some light or evidence on the psychic nature of the abominable snowmen. The same thudding, hollow, thumping noise we heard at night preceding the attack, we also had heard in broad daylight, although not nearly so loud. One of our party was a little irritated with me. On our excursions, he usually led the way and I followed a little behind with the others. He kept hearing that sound, and occasionally he turned around and would say, "What's that?" After 6 or 8 miles of him doing this, and after a few general discussions about the noise, he quickly turned around one more time and eyed me, and said, "By golly, boys, it's not Fred making that noise after all." But he decided to give it a double check. He made an excuse and wandered away from camp. When he came back, he said, "Now I'm certain it's none of us. I walked for half an hour, and everywhere I went I heard it. Sounds like there's a hollow drum in the earth somewhere and something is hitting it." There is no doubt in my mind that these beings were present and observing us, but they had not yet appeared in physical form. Another very striking experience which shows that they cannot be natural beings with natural bodies. It was before we made our cabin, and we were staying in a tent then. The tent was below a little cone-shaped mountain called Pumy Butte. A little creek flowed nearby, and there was a moist sandbar about an acre in area. We would go there and wash our cooking utensils and bring our drinking water back. Early one morning, Hank came back to the tent. He was rather excited. He led us to the moist sandbar and took us almost to the center. There in the center of the sandbar were 2 huge tracks about 4 inches deep. There was not another track on that sandbar. There we were, standing in the middle of the sandbar, and not one of us could conceive any earthly thing taking steps 160 feet long. No human being could have made these tracks, Hank said, and there's only one way they could be made. Something dropped from the sky and went back up. There was no third step. This is certainly another indication of what I'm saying about manifestation. I have heard it said that many ages ago the Rocky Mountain and Cascade Mountain ranges were a center of a great civilization. I do think the mountain areas are extra sensitive to spiritual vibration, usually of a higher order but sometimes lower. We ourselves, being extra sensitive to spiritual vibration, probably had come into contact with the manifestation of these beings easier than perhaps the average person would have. In the true sense, everything in the material world is a manifestation. Ever since the time the first essence of consciousness formed from the great void, we cannot describe different planes or dimensions of being were created or manifested. Occasionally, we of this dimension or of space can be conscious of other beings of a different vibration and consciousness. The abominable snowmen are from a lower plane. When the condition and vibration is at a certain frequency, they can easily, for a time, appear in a very solid body. They are not animal spirits, but also lack the intelligence of a human consciousness. When reading of evolution, we have read many times conjecture about the missing link between man and the anthropoid ape. The snowmen are a missing link in consciousness, neither animal nor human. They are very close to our dimension, and yet are part of one lower. Could they be the missing link man has been so long searching for? The human soul once dwelled in a spiritual body, and eventually incarnated, at the fall of man, into bodies like we have now. The beings we call abominable snowmen were not of the necessary high development to incarnate in human form. They had not reached that scale of spiritual evolution. They are the easiest beings materialized, as evidenced by the many reports of their appearances to more people in recent years. In fact, if the vibratory influence right for them is present, they can manifest without any human being present at all. This accounts for the many tracks being seen along the mountain ranges of the West Coast and Canada. When this age or cycle of life that we are in moves on eventually to a higher cycle, and all life moves forward, these beings may stay and move up in consciousness in some other world in the far distant future. Perhaps the ape beings will toil the road of intelligence in that world, which none of us can even imagine, and perhaps they too will lose nothing and gain by their experience. Most theories picture the snowmen as material beings hiding in caves and scampering over the mountains. The law of probability would be that eventually one would be found if their bodies were of physical construction only. If one claims only the physical laws to explain their existence, then we can use a material logic to prove or disprove the premise. If they are material life, definite material evidence would surely be found. What material evidence we do have, in my opinion, which I believe firmly to be true, only shows material extrances into this plane, followed by the supernatural exits back into their own realm. I and my companions have shot them, but could find no trace of them. If they were material life like we know it to be on this globe, one would die naturally or accidentally and the remains be found. The easy way out for lots of people is to just consider it a wild tale. But too many people have seen them, and the evidence is piling up to definitely prove this. The same line of escapism of thought concerning phenomenal sightings of flying saucers is evident. A report recently showed 5 million Americans claim to have seen flying saucers. Material things usually make a big splash in the material world, and spiritual things often do not make a ripple there. Why? We can give proof of a phenomenon, but its nature is immersed in the spiritual and can only be explained by laws of the spiritual. But these happenings, that seem strange to people, is serving a very useful purpose. It is causing more people to think, and that is a path in the right direction. The Bigfoot are just one small mystery among many. Someday more people will conceive that the greatest proportion of life is a mystery, and he will seek and find solutions to them, and then the mysteries will be unveiled in their pure forms, and from that unveiling man will find greater life. Manifestation is made possible by vibration of power and certain fine substances. Being manifested can be seen, heard, and take a definite form, sometimes less tangible, but also, under other conditions, take a very tangible form. It is time for the world to pick up its ears about the subject of psychic phenomenon, and this more people are doing, but if there is a phenomenon, there is also a world from which its qualities are manifested. Those were the words of Fred Beck. His story is done now, but we're going to continue to look into a newspaper article from 1964 that has to do with his story. Legendary Mount Saint Helen's ape men called legitimate. Longview Daily News, June 1964. The legend of the ape men of Mount Saint Helens returns like hay fever with summer weather. The story of the ape men of the beautiful conical mountains situated in the Cascade Range of southwest Washington is a favorite in the area, but it just may have some basis in fact. There is more basis to support it than Nepal's Yeti or Northern California's Bigfoot, and probably as much as Loch Ness Monster. Last summer, 2 different Portland groups who visited the region reported sightings of the monsters usually described as from 7 to 10 feet tall, hairy, and either white or beige colored. 3 persons in a car on a lonely forest road said they saw one of these creatures when it flashed across the headlights of their car near the wilderness area, which includes such places as Ape Canyon. A Portland couple fishing on the Lewis River south of the mountain saw a huge beige figure, bigger than any human, amble off into the brush. Old-timers aren't surprised, just amused. The ape-man legend actually is older than the white man's habitation of the Pacific Northwest. Forestry employees have investigated many reports of the strange creatures. According to Indian legend, the apes were the ferocious Silatic Indians, a band of renegades, much like giant apes in appearance, who lived like wild animals in the secluded caves of the Cascades. The first recorded encounter of the apes with white men was in 1924. A group of 5 prospectors rushed into Kelso to report that a group of great ape-like creatures had attacked them in the middle of the night. Bob Lee of Portland, a leader of the 1961 Himalayan expedition and advisor to the last year's Himalayan expedition, said last year he had a strange experience. Lee has never claimed to have seen the apes, but said there was something strange on the high slopes of the mountain. He was a member of a party that searched for Jim Carter, an experienced skier and mountaineer who vanished on the mountain in 1950. His disappearance remains a mystery. At the time, Lee was a member of the Seattle Mountain Search and Rescue Unit. He described the search for Carter as, quote, the most eerie experience I ever had, end quote. He said that every time he was cut off from the rest of the search party, he felt somebody was watching him. Carter, he said, had climbed the mountain with some companions on a warm, clear Sunday. He left the group to take a picture and said he would ski to the left of the group. He was never seen again. His tracks, however, indicated that he suddenly took off down the mountain in a wild, death-defying run that no experienced skier would make, unless he was pursued, Lee said. The track went in the direction of Ape Canyon, but no trace of Carter or his equipment was found, although the area was combed for 2 weeks. Lee recalled stories of about 25 persons who claimed they had encountered the monsters during a 20-year period. The canyon named for the apes is a lonely, ominous spot in a wild area. It extends to a point near Ape Cave, thought to be the longest unitary lava tube in the world. There have been many reports of footprints in the area. Some are described as being about 18 inches long and seemingly human. Unless the creatures are really fuzzy throwbacks, the Lost Indian tribe theory seems most likely to some of the fans of the mystery. It has given rise to some suggestions, one of which is to leave well enough alone. The government might take over and shove benefits and subsidies at them, retroactive to the Ice Age. And that, as well as costing a lot of money, would ruin a very good legend. That was the end of the newspaper article. Now, I don't know about you guys, but Fred Beck's story is extremely fascinating. Not only his story, but his opinion about his experience as well. I think that there's a lot more to the subject of the abominable snowmen, the Sasquatch, the Bigfoot, these giant hairy humanoids, than most people realize. Fred Beck was onto something, and we're going to continue to figure out what exactly these mysterious beings are. It's one of the last great mysteries in the world, and I believe it's worth looking into. Thanks for listening to the BLC. Be sure to subscribe and share. And it would be really awesome if you'd be willing to take just a minute to give us a review, as that helps this show out a ton.